And Jeff counts?
Jeff counts.
Great, thank you.
David does.
Dave, yeah.
I mean, not David, Colin. Right.
So we have
I'm
4.
correct. David doesn't count either. He's not here.
He's not here. David doesn't count. He's not here.
Sorry,
Colin doesn't
Colin.
count, but you have a
All right.
quorum with 4.
All right, I just didn't know if Jeff counted because he's planning board, right?
Yep. He's a voting member.
Okay.
So
Colin.
Grand.
Ex
right.
officio.
Yep.
No vote.
All right, well, I am going to
Just
open.
here for the beer.
Yeah, you're here for the beer.
I don't even,
Okay.
and I don't even drink.
I'm going to call to order this Newmarket Conservation Commission meeting Thursday, July 14th, 2022, with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right.
Melissa Sharples,
Here.
Chris Blackstone,
Here.
Sam Kenny,
Here.
Jeff Goldknopp, and Colin White.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Do we have anyone for public comment? Doesn't look it, so we will go right through that. Okay, Chris, wanted to hand it over to you to introduce our guest speaker.
Oh, sure. Thank you. All right. It's nice to see you here and you can be with us. And this is a joy of Zoom since Nate Grace does live in another part of the state, so it's not ecologically sound for him to drive down here. I first met him through a program that he did for the Rockingham County Conservation District. And he was there to talk about other things on the other side of his brain, which is his role as a municipal association attorney. But looking at him and reviewing a little bit of things that I learned about him, this seemed so fascinating, and he agreed to be with us tonight so that people here and people zooming in or on our recordings can learn about carnivorous plants of New England. So we talk about spring ephemerals, we talk about lovely fall foliage, we talk about nativars and cultivars and perennials and what we're doing for pollinators. This is a whole nother aspect of botany and the hort world that he's bringing to us tonight. So thanks for your time and welcome, and thanks for sending your PowerPoint. I did take a peek at it, and I can't wait to hear it again with your narration to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I'm very happy to be here. As you said, I guess my hobby is being a lawyer, depending on who you speak to, and my passion is plants. So I'm fairly well known for carnivorous plants. And what you're seeing right now, right in front of you, is really just a picture of a typical bog. One of the things you're going to notice throughout the PowerPoint is I haven't told you specific locations. I've just referred to them by kind of my own designations. And the reason for that is because these are rare plants. And there are, unfortunately, a number of bad actors in the world who do like to take plants from the wild. And with rare plants, that's a significant problem because there aren't many of them. So I've left actual locations off all of these pictures. Well, what you're seeing here is really kind of a typical bog scene in really anywhere in New England in the spring and summertime. So if you were to go out right now, go kayaking around someplace, you might see these little red flowers popping up, and those are actually from our native purple pitcher plant, Sarracenia purpurea, and that's probably the most common carnivore that you're going to see that you're actually going to notice. I'm going to talk about a bunch of other ones that we have in the state and throughout New England, and then I'm going to talk about how do you find these in the wild. Obviously, with the Conservation Commission, you do a lot of assessments with wetlands. You want to know what's there. You want to have some idea of what you're looking at. And so I think that's really important for you guys to know. Talk a little bit about conservation issues. As I mentioned, these are rare plants. And of course, everybody loves to garden, right? So if you love plants, you probably want to grow them yourself. So I want to talk about those, and I'm happy to answer questions. It's always a little hard over Zoom, but do feel free to jump in, and I'm happy to have a slide at the end that just asks kind of general questions as well. So I'll just jump right into some carnivorous plants of New England. We actually have a large number of species, which surprises people because they always think carnivorous plants and they see, you immediately picture Venus flytraps, you immediately picture kind of really exotic types of plants. Funny enough, Venus flytraps are actually from North Carolina, so not really that exotic. And in fact, there are a lot of temperate places that have many carnivorous plants, including where we live. Really, the key to finding carnivorous plants is they live someplace that the plants can't get nutrients from the soil. So we recently saw, earlier this spring, or maybe it was last spring, kind of one of the wildflowers out on the West Coast that's fairly common ends up being carnivorous. It has kind of a sticky substance on some of its leaves sometimes, which attracts insects. They get stuck there, and it eats them. So as I mentioned, we have purple pitcher plants. That's probably the most common. We have a number of sundews. You might have seen those if you go to any sort of nurseries. They're somewhat common to see more tropical sundews usually available. Really, unless you're a specialist, a lot of these look very, very similar. The ones that are in light blue are ones we do not have in New Hampshire. So we actually have a couple species of sundews. There are 3 other ones in New England. We don't have those. We have a number of bladderworts, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of those. It's interesting because one of the fun little facts about climate change is as we get warmer here in New Hampshire, we also see southern species expand their range. So I put Utricularia subulata in a light gray color because we've actually been seeing it expand its range over the last 50 years or so. So if you go on, Go Botany or one of those websites that shows you a range, it shows really that it's pretty rare in Massachusetts, really in the southern part of Massachusetts near the Cape area, which is obviously several USDA zones warmer than anywhere in New Hampshire. But the reality is it's being found elsewhere, in other bogs. And one of the prime ways that carnivorous plants are distributed is, of course, through seed. And one of the prime ways it's distributed through seed is through actually becoming attached via mud to the feet of waterfowl. So as they migrate north and south, you have some traveling that goes on there. And one of the interesting genetic studies that was done a couple years ago showed that there was actually a type of sundew in South America that migrated from Australia via probably that route. And it's just unique. It happened that some bird flew out there, and now there's a colony of them. And then probably the rarest carnivorous plant that we have in New Hampshire is a species of Butterwort. This is not common in North America. It is something that if you happen to go in the Alps in Europe, you'll see quite a bit more frequently than you will here in the United States. So American pitcher plants have a pretty big range. There's somewhere between 8 and 11 plus species, depending on who you talk to, what analysis you're looking at. Realistically, we have one species, which is the purple pitcher plant. You see that on the left-hand side here. And I have a bigger picture here. It's technically subspecies Purpurea is what most people call it. So it's the northern subspecies of Sarracenia purpurea. The range where it overlaps with the southern species is somewhere around New Jersey, but it's not really clear, and it's not really clear what the historical range is. As with many plants, they were very common at one point in time. They started disappearing. That's when people started noticing, and it was really before really the advent of conservation of any sort, or sort of cataloging ranges of any sort. So if you ever have the opportunity or are interested at all in sort of botanical histories, I live in Concord. There was a good botanical history done of Concord back in the 1800s. It tells you all sorts of fun facts, like Pink lady slippers could be found basically everywhere, all over the city. That's not true today. They're very rare. Obviously, we have a lot of development here, but even in conserved spaces, they're very rare. And so a lot of species we think of as very rare were much more common back then, not only because of development, but also just if, they didn't have that human interaction that we have now. So as I mentioned, this is probably the one you'll see most often. It's also what you'll see most often mislabeled at stores. So you may go to a nursery, they'll have some Sarracenia kind of on display for sale, and they'll of course call them purple pitcher plants, and they won't be. They'll be a hybrid of some sort. There'll be another species, but there are sometimes you'll actually get the actual species. We have a number of sundews, and they are very widely distributed throughout the world. One of the most widely distributed carnivorous plants. We actually have some fairly rare sundews here as well. So on the left-hand side, you'll see Drosera Louisiana. That's actually a hybrid between the two species we have here in New Hampshire, rotundifolia and intermedia. And what's interesting about sundews is they are self-pollinating for their flowers. And so one of the questions that always arises with plants like this, because they're small, where they're distributed, they're fairly common, is that when we find hybrids, are those fertile hybrids? Are they actually, something that's reproducing? Most hybrid sundews are not fertile. You won't see a range of hybrids with those. They're really set species, and you might have some hybrids between them. But there is one location in New Hampshire where it appears that we might have fertile hybrids. So they're actually reproducing. We see them at a much higher rate than we would expect for just the occasional cross-pollination between the two species, which is extraordinarily rare because they are self-fertile, and they have very small flowers, so they really don't attract a lot of pollinators. That's different than purple pitcher plants and other species of pitcher plants, where I said there are between 8 and 11 species, because there are a lot of hybrids between those. Those are all fertile hybrids. We have some pretty good idea of kind of the basic outlines, but one of the things you learn when you garden and you experiment, and you become well known in the area of carnivorous plants or any other area, is people love to say, hey, I got some seed from some plant in my yard and I grew it and sent it to you, and you get the chance to grow it, and you discover some of the southern ones don't grow very well up here. Not much of a surprise, right? They evolved down in Florida or wherever the case may be. And so, of course, they're not adapted to New England. But there's some other small differences that you discover. There's a lot of genetic work being done on these plants, and like plants across the world and across the spectrum. So hopefully we get that resolved at some point in time in the future. Probably the most common sundew that you're going to see is Drosera rotundifolia here in New Hampshire. So if you're a big kayaker, you will see this will probably be the species you see growing on the floating logs. And they are quite tiny. They're about as big as your thumb, probably on average, maybe a little bit bigger. So they're really hard to notice. But that's what you'll see most often. You'll see them around a lot of lake edges in New Hampshire, and they're actually a good indication of the health of a lake. So if you go, it's kind of a sandy area, right on the margins there. You'll see them above the high tide line, but where it's still damp. All of our carnivores like to be in damp conditions, and these are really a good indication that there's a very low incidence of pollution in the lake. Most of our lakes are kind of an acidic basis. And when they do see a high pollution level, these really don't tolerate that. If you have a lot of fertilizer runoff, carnivorous plants won't be growing there, because of course that'll be available nitrogen, available other nutrients to plants, and they'll just get outcompeted to the extent they could survive that type of environment. By far the most common carnivorous plant that we have, and the one you will probably notice the least, is the Bladderwort, Utricularia. I guess I should have talked a little bit about how these plants capture prey, right? So the pitcher plants kind of go along with the name. You'll see that they have leaves that are basically pitchers, and ants usually and other non-winged insects will fall inside. Because our pitchers don't have a lid, they will fill up with water, and insects will drown. It's actually interesting because northern pitcher plants, purple pitcher plants, they don't produce digestive enzymes like the southern ones. So they rely entirely on bacterial action. They don't have a lid over the top, so that really makes a lot of sense because as it rains, they overflow. And the bacteria breaks down the insects, and then they are able to absorb those nutrients. Sundews, they have sticky leaves. So insects of all kinds will land on them, get stuck. As the insect struggles, they will actually produce more digestive enzymes, and also more kind of glue, so to speak, and they'll get stuck there. Some sundews will actually have their leaves curl around insects. Ours really don't move that much. And if you want to see some really good footage of this, David Attenborough actually has a new documentary coming out on PBS, I think, in August, called The Green Planet, and a lot of it covers carnivorous plants. There's quite a bit of footage on it, and it's really high resolution, really great footage. Bladderworts are different. They're really our only active trap that we have here in New Hampshire. So each one of these little bladder-like devices that you see on the plant is actually basically a compressed bag, and they have a couple trigger hairs out front of it, and so as protozoa and other really tiny creatures hit the trigger hairs, they usually hit them a couple of times. The plant will actually suck in water and the creature, and then produce digestive enzymes and break it down. And it's a really interesting trap because it's one of the fastest movements in nature, and certainly in the plant kingdom. So something like a Venus flytrap is really cool because you can see it actually move as it's triggered. Bladderworts are so fast you can't see it. They actually, to capture that on film, they actually have to slow down the footage, which is a pretty incredible feat. As I mentioned, it's one of the most common carnivorous plants that we have here in New Hampshire. It's also probably the one you'll notice the least. It's really just looks like a whole bunch of all the other weeds in our lakes and rivers, and mostly the only time you'll notice it is when it's flowering, or if you happen to be out there trying to remove milfoil, because it actually looks fairly similar to milfoil. When DES does their training on what does milfoil look like, how do you remove it, they actually have a couple slides on bladderworts and try to show you the difference because they're so frequently confused. Probably the most common bladderwort that you're going to notice out there is Utricularia inflata, which when it's in flower has this kind of 5-wheeled, 6-wheeled spoke that the flower comes out of, and the flower is going to be yellow. Most of our bladderworts have yellow flowers, and so it really does look like a wheel spoke there. It likes calm waters. You won't find this in the middle of the river, but you might find it in coves. It's not infrequent along the Connecticut, where I live, and kayak sometimes. but more often than not, you're going to see it in ponds, on pond edges, and it blooms pretty early in the year, usually April, May. It's getting a little bit past the point in time when you're going to see it, but you might notice it float, or parts of it anyway, floating along. And unlike other plants, one of the really neat things about bladderworts is basically if you break off any section of the plant, it will just produce a new plant. Most of these are not rooted in any way to anything. They really don't have roots. They really don't have leaves. They just look very much like what in close-up what I showed you before. They're very hard to photograph, so I apologize. I don't have a lot of them in the water. But that's really what you're going to see is just kind of this floating little mass, and you'll catch it on your oar in ponds. The other one that we have that you might notice is Utricularia cornuta. It's usually grows in masses, and especially in your part of the state, the southeastern part of the state, a number of bogs that I've been to down there, you see this really in concentration. So if you see really a large number of yellow flowers really on the water's edge, that's probably what you're looking at. Again, like all of these other plants, they really don't like high nutrient areas. They like acidic water. They're not going to be tolerant of a lot of runoff from different sources. And the last species, or I should say genus, that we have here in New Hampshire is Butterwort. It's Pinguicula. It's similar to Sundews in that it has sticky leaves, but the kind of little bristles that the glue is on top of are so small that to us they just feel greasy. So they really catch gnats, really, really tiny insects. And if you ever see them, there's 2 known spots in New Hampshire. They're in the mountains. I do not rock climb, so I have not seen them in the wild. I've attempted one of the locations a couple times, but it's such a difficult traverse that unless you're really an expert rock climber, the likelihood of you seeing this is very low. There's also one incident in Vermont of this plant. Realistically, virtually all butterworts look the same. They look the same to me. I grow several of them, and they all look like what you're looking at right now. It's going to be a small little yellowish plant, and if you touch the leaves, it's going to be greasy. That's really what it looks like. It's an alpine plant, so it happens much more frequently up in Canada, much more common there. We don't have a lot of alpine zones here in New Hampshire, and not a lot of alpine zones that are going to be able to grow this, because this really relies on sort of a calcium-based soil. So all of our soil is, by and large, based off granite. It's very acidic. We don't have a lot of locations here that would actually be able to support this this genus. But if you're ever in Mexico, for whatever reason, they have like 300 species of butterworts, and really what's neat about them is they have really different brightly colored flowers. Costa Rica, Mexico, and the type that they have down there not only will grow in kind of desert conditions or conditions that are desert-like half the year, where they will go into this kind of succulent mode and then be carnivorous the other half the year, but they also have a number that grow on trees and tree trunks, and so that's something, if you ever go on a vacation down there, you happen to be in the right area, your guide might point out to you. So, interestingly, of the butterworts that grow in New Hampshire, we have one species. I don't have any pictures of that. I do have pictures of this non-native Pinguicula grandiflora. That's actually from Europe. This particular one was from Ireland, but there are plenty of other places over there that it grows. And it's much easier to grow than our species because it's not an alpine species. So they're actually, there's a private botanical garden and former nursery over in Vermont. They grew this actually just along a little kind of waterway that they had built. It was just happily growing there, and I was really surprised the first time I went, and I was like, wait a minute, what? This isn't supposed to be here. So that was pretty cool. And again, they're really known for their flowers, so that's when you're going to notice them. They flower in mid-June. This species, like ours, has kind of a purplish, light-colored flower. So how are you going to find carnivorous plants in the wild? Really, you're looking for places that are acidic. You're probably going to most notice them in late spring and midsummer. So right now is a great time if you're big into kayaking, big into hiking, big into exploring bogs. This is really the time because you not only have the bladderworts flowering, but the sundews are going to be a really bright red color. And that's something that's really neat about these plants is they really change color throughout the year. So sundews in the wintertime, they bundle up into what are called hibernacula. So basically all the leaves come down into like a little fist. So you will never notice them. But when they open up in the spring, you're really not going to notice them because they're going to be green, very close in color, probably with the surrounding vegetation. But throughout the summer, especially once we get past late June with the long days, they're really going to color up brightly red by and large. And you're going to see them in little clumps like you see there on the screen. The pitcher plants are a little bit different. Really, depending where you go, they could be green, they could be red with the same amount of sun. It's really variable. And of course, they're really found in a variety of wetlands across a variety of ecological landscapes throughout New England. Massachusetts is the most diverse state, I'm sorry to report, but they do have the most, I guess, ecologically interesting history, geological history. If you've ever looked at really the geology of Massachusetts, they have pine barrens, which are not common, really north of New Jersey, but they have some, and those really bleed into the Cape, which are really sand dunes. And that's all part of the last few glacial cycles when that part of Massachusetts wasn't really covered by the glaciers, and to the extent they were, it managed to create these type of environments, whereas sort of western Massachusetts and middle Massachusetts was basically the same as New Hampshire in terms of that glacial treatment. And because of that, we have a different sort of ecological areas. And I did want to show you some of those. Most of what we see here in New Hampshire are really mountains, hilltop bogs, kettle bogs, things of that nature. But the good news is, because our state isn't as ecologically diverse, carnivorous plants are really found all over the state. They're actually very common in our lakes because our lakes, unlike most lakes south of New Hampshire, were never used by industry, never used to dump chemicals in or anything. So we have a lot of very pristine lakes, which is great for ecological diversity and really great for carnivores. Uncommonly, you can find some on cliff sides in kind of wet areas. And again, the ones you're really going to see are the pitcher plants, the sundews, and the bladderworts. And occasionally, if you're up in the White Mountains, you might get the chance, and you rock climb, you might get the chance to see some butterworts. And we really have 5 common ecosystems here in New England where we're going to see carnivorous plants. I've ordered these really in order of what we're going to see here in New Hampshire. So most commonly in your area are kettle bogs. Then really north, mostly in Vermont, although in Coos County we have some boreal bogs. We have a few, I should say, Atlantic white cedar swamps. And then, of course, in Massachusetts, some pine barrens and some sand dunes. And most commonly, we have bogs. You know, a bog is basically a freshwater wetland that's oxygen poor. It usually doesn't have much water flow across it. If it has water flow across it, that's called a fen. It's just a little bit different. You see a lot of very similar species there. Whatever nutrients are there are really trapped in the decaying plant matter, and you're going to see a lot of sphagnum moss. If you see sphagnum moss, that's a really good indication that you're in an acidic environment and one that's wet most of the year. And whether you're in a boreal bog or a kettle bog, you're going to see a lot of very similar species. Oftentimes you'll have an open patch of water in the middle, and then kind of the bog slowly coming in, slowly taking that over, and then on the edge of the bog, you're going to have the surrounding forest coming in. And eventually, over the course of tens of thousands of years, the bog will close up, the forest will take over. But that's really what we see. Kettle bogs were created by glacial retreat when basically a large chunk of the glacier ice was left behind in a carve-out dip. There's no additional water that comes in through any sort of ground sources. It's all reliant on rainwater. And there are a couple of kettle bogs down in your area that are pretty well known, and you can find carnivores there as well as elsewhere. And really what makes them unique is they're probably the most fragile type of ecosystem we have, simply because they're entirely dependent on rain to replenish the water. So whether they are currently in more of a lake state or more of a dry state, one of the things we've been seeing over the past decade or so is increasingly long periods of drought in the southeastern part of the state, and that's had pretty significant impacts on wetlands, especially kettle bogs. Then we have some traditional bogs, of course, throughout the state. A lot of those are found in the Connecticut River Valley. Funny enough, if you hike to the head of the Connecticut River, you'll find there's a bog there, and there's not only a couple springs, but there's actually a bog there, and so I always joke that we have such great produce along the Connecticut River because it all starts with that fly dying in that purple pitcher plant that gets flooded, and then it starts the flow of nutrients down the river. So traditional bogs often have some other source of water coming into the bog, but they don't actually have an outlet. They sometimes do. It's I don't know, it's imprecise science, I guess. And in New Hampshire, kind of unsurprisingly, a lot of our bogs are older, which means we see a lot more of that forest coming in and less of the open water areas in the middle. A lot of these have already been preserved, often through the Nature Conservancy and other conservation alliances, conservation groups. Back in the 1800s, many of them were mined for peat. It's not profitable, hasn't been profitable for a long time. So really a lot of landowners have said, look, I mean, why am I holding on to this? I can't do anything with it. The expense of trying to drain it and do something with it versus just, using it as a tax write-off just doesn't make sense. So that's some good news on the conservation front. one of the more unique bog types that we have in New Hampshire are boreal bogs, and these are really leftover remnants of kind of the ecosystems we had back when we had sort of that glacial retreat starting after we were no longer covered by glaciers, but you know, and they have some rare species there. Those aren't usually rare plant species as much as rare animal species. Gray jays, they do have black spruce, which is not that common, and they're frequently in areas that are a little bit cooler than the surrounding area, and often the forest around them is really covered in pretty dense moss. And if you have the misfortune of going in June during black fly season, it's far worse than anywhere else in the state, as I learned, unfortunately, one year. There are a few associated plant species that you'll see with carnivores, or a good indication you should look around for some carnivores. Those are laurels, so this is a sheep laurel. Mountain laurels are somewhat common. Rhodora is really a key species. If you see Rhodora, that'll be in bloom in early June. Cotton grass is something you'll see. You'll notice it more often in late summer or early fall. If you've never seen it before, it really is what it looks like. It looks like a little cotton ball on top of a stalk of grass. It's really cool when you see a lot of them. And blueberries, because most wild blueberries live in areas that are fairly moist. So usually we're talking about high bush blueberries, so the actual bushes that are taller, rather than the low bush ones, because those live in a slightly different environment. But you get blueberries and other kind of very similar types of berries. There are also some water plants you can be on the lookout for. Iris, so we have blue flag iris here. If you see yellow iris, that's invasive, so feel free to pull that out and throw that away. It's on our invasive species list. Rose begonias, you may see those around. You may know where some of those are. Those grow in bogs. Planthera and other types of bog orchids you might notice. Those usually all bloom in summertime. I have some rose begonias in my bogs in my front yard. And they just finished blooming last week. And of course, sphagnum moss. That's really the number one key. That's what we're going to see most frequently here. In fact, if you look closely at the picture here, you actually see some sundews in the sphagnum. They're just so closely interrelated. And then we have Atlantic white cedar swamps. You have some of those down in your areas. Really, they're found in more coastal areas. They're always found in depressions in the landscape, and they're usually near sea level. That's just, for whatever reason, that's where Atlantic white cedars grow. All the ones in our state, as far as I'm aware, are mature Atlantic white cedar swamps. So most of the ones that are conserved will have boardwalks through them. You might find some purple pitcher plants there. They'll have really low light levels in the understory. Carnivorous plants, by and large, grow out in the open bog. So they like full sun. They like as much sun as possible. And really, if you're familiar with how these swamps work, they're really kind of the end before either a fire comes through and it's opened up again, or really the forest closes in. So this is really kind of the end of the cycle. And the carnivorous plants you see there will be growing there for the next however many years until whatever the next stage is happens. But I have found them in a few different swamps in the state. As far as diversity richness goes, not only in carnivorous plants but other types of plants, you might want to take a trip down to Massachusetts, near the Cape. They have some conserved lands that are really nice down there, that have a large number of species. So I went with somebody with the New England Carnivorous Plant Society, now a number of years ago. But we did find one floating island that was just entirely Utricularia cornuta. So we called it Cornuta Island, and it was just this mass of yellow, and so that's what you see there. They also have some plants that are fairly rare. We don't see very frequently up here, like this pink-flowered bladderwort, and they have Drosera filiformis, which is the threadleaf sundew. It looks really like grass. It's about 6 inches tall, except that its grass-like leaves have a sticky, substance that all sundew leaves have, and it captures insects, and it grows in a slightly different environment because it grows really in a sandy area, and that's what pine barrens are. They're really interesting ecological niche. And there are a number of other different colored bladderworts that are not very common compared to what we see here in New Hampshire. But I think on the bottom right there, you'll see a pretty good picture of what these look like in water. Basically just kind of a thin thread with a little bit of sort of leaf-like substance and coming off them below the surface. So that's probably what you'll see if you're looking for them. And of course they have sand dunes as well, and that's really an early evolution of the coastal plain. So the southeastern part of the United States is all really a sandy coastal plain. They have other species of carnivorous plants, and really sand dunes are that early evolution. They're basically sand. There's very little organic material mixed in there. So they're, again, very nutrient poor, but in a different way than something you'd see as a typical bog here in New Hampshire. And so on the southeast coastal plain, you'll see other types of carnivores. So I was down in Virginia a couple years ago and went out and found one of the few stands of Sarracenia flava out there. I had a little bit of help with directions. And saw those in flower. So those are much taller, tubular pitcher plants that they really function the same way, except that they have a lid over the top, and so they keep out rainwater. Generally speaking, the species that keep out rainwater produce digestive enzymes. The ones that do not and would allow in rainwater do not produce digestive enzymes, at least for North American species. So there are some conservation issues that you really should be aware of. And the biggest threat, of course, is human activity. I mean, it is everywhere in every context for conservation, of course. Realistically, the biggest threat is habitat destruction. It's not as big a threat in New Hampshire for direct habitat destruction. There isn't really I don't think the real estate market and property values are at the point where it makes a lot of financial sense for people to go out and try to drain a bog and build on it. That's not the case elsewhere in the United States, but it's not really the case here in New Hampshire. We might see some on-site draining, plowing, etc., but it's not very frequent. More often than not, where you'll see destruction happen is wintertime. It'll freeze over. People will snowmobile, or in mud season, people ATV. OHRV use is really obviously devastating to any type of conservation effort for plants because the plants can't get out of the way and they get all chewed up. One of the more frequent problems, though, that we see here in our state are off-site changes. One of the things that we've recognized over the past couple of decades, DES does some good studies on this, is that a lot of runoff water ends up in some of our lakes, etc. And so we've done some changes and some recommended changes with use of road salt, changes in grade in roadways in order to avoid kind of runoff causing issues. And I know on the seacoast that's something that many communities are exploring with the nitrogen runoff and looking at that and where that's going to. And part of that process has also revealed really kind of the overall network of how water flows throughout our state. And of course, when it ends up in something like a kettle bog, which doesn't have much runoff, it really relies on rainwater. When we see things like that happening, that can cause a change in the pH, as we saw with acid rain back in the 80s, which wasn't necessarily bad for carnivorous plants, but was bad in other ways. And it can really have kind of a negative impact because of how interconnected all of these different plants are and species are in this one zone. So habitat destruction is definitely the biggest problem. It's also the one that's really hardest to stop, to identify and stop. But the second biggest threat is poaching. So taking plants from the wild. It's a huge issue for rare and endangered plants. Not only carnivorous plants, you see this really with orchids much more frequently than any other type of plant. But carnivorous plants, they do have a market. And typically with those, we see them dug up and sold without any kind of management strategy. And that's always really the problem. Most frequently, you hear about it in the news in the context of Venus flytraps. North Carolina actually has made it a felony to remove Venus flytraps from the wild. They prosecuted some people under that because they are a very rare species. They only occur in about a 90-mile radius from the city of Wilmington. And in New England, it's still a problem. And I actually have a couple of slides on that. But our third biggest threat, of course, is climate change. We're seeing changes in precipitation amounts and occurrences. If you read the Union Leader this morning, one of the small articles that was about halfway through was detailing some studies from UNH about how we've seen change in our precipitation over the past few decades here in New Hampshire. And one of the things we've been seeing, of course, is more frequent droughts and longer droughts, as well as at the same time more rain, but that rain occurring in very short occurrences. So what was it, 2 days ago maybe, we had that rainstorm that went through here in New Hampshire. I have a rain gauge outside. In about 20 minutes it rained an inch, which caused significant problems with the drainage throughout the municipality. But it also was bad for my garden because while the recommended amounts to water every week are about an inch, over a 20-minute period, that's a little bit too fast for the soil to absorb. So a lot of that just ran off down into eventually the river. And so we've seen that cause some problems with carnivorous plant habitats. Since they're in a wet area, it's more often the droughts that are causing problems than anything else. Really, the biggest problem with poaching is the disclosure of locations. So, as you've probably figured out by now throughout this point in the presentation, I have wandered around all sorts of wild areas throughout New England, and gone through all sorts of swamps and bogs, and learned exactly what type of gear I need to have with me and wear, and how many changes of clothes I need in my car, and towels. And one of the things I did with some members from the New England Carnivorous Plant Society now a long time ago was we went through and tried to sort of catalog plants throughout the state, see in southern New Hampshire, and see where there were rare plants. We found a couple of sites of rare plants, and since obviously we're very familiar with nativars and cultivars and all of that, they're of course rare forms of plants in the wild. They use those as the basis to breed all of these different cultivars. And one of the rare types of plants that you see in the wild are ones that lack any sort of pigmentation. So these are heterophila plants. They're all green is kind of the common English. And so you'll see that in the picture here. You know, we have the northern pitcher plant, the purple pitcher plant. Typically that's red. In low light, it'll be mostly green, but you'll see some red on it. Its flowers are always red, regardless of light. The petals will always be red. But in the heterophila form, the all-green form, they're really this chartreuse, yellowish-green color, and their flowers are green as well. So there were a couple sites of that in New Hampshire, and unfortunately, the information about where they were located got out a little bit wider than it should have. And within a couple years, you know, we did site surveys again. One of those sites completely gone from, and then on the other site there were far lower numbers according to our plant count. And one thing I should mention is all these carnivorous plants are perennials. So if you plant a pitcher plant, it will grow. It grows from a rhizome. Our native plants, the rhizome is vertical rather than horizontal, but over time they slowly expand. We don't know what the lifespan is on them. It's longer than anyone has ever cared to count. These plants could be there for, you know, at least 50 years. That's as far as anyone's bothered to count at this point in time. I guess the number is slowly ticking up over time, but you know, when you go back to a place and you realize that the plants aren't there that are supposed to be there, it's pretty shocking. The problem is much more pronounced, of course, in Massachusetts. They have more people. Something like the Blue Hills Reservation has a little bog. It was pretty well advertised. They had carnivorous plants there, and really the numbers of plants have just drastically decreased since any CPS has been keeping track of that. So it's really prudent to limit disclosure of sites, particularly when they have rare plants there. I know in Maine, many of their conservation areas now have game cameras, and they pretty prominently post there are game cameras, and if you steal plants, you'll be prosecuted. That seems to help, and that's something that they're doing in a pretty obvious way. It's something you might consider. You might tell other, you know, conservation commissions in other towns that have, you know, rare ecologies that they could consider doing, because it does seem to help cut down on that. And I do want to emphasize how serious a threat poaching is, because these are very rare plants regardless of their state or federal status. They live in very specialized environments. And not only with the purple pitcher plants, but this is really a significant threat. There was a Sundew that was that all-green form. About 2 months after it was initially documented, we went back to do some more documentation, and it wasn't there anymore. It was pretty obvious that it had been dug up by someone. And, you know, if you spend enough time in bogs, you know the difference between a trowel mark and, you know, a raccoon digging in something. And it just didn't make sense that it would be anything other than a trowel. And it's really a problem not only in New England, but it's across the world. Sometimes you'll see news reports about the tropical pitcher plants over in the Philippines and Malaysia being taken from the wild, particularly in the Mount Kinabalu area. And it really has a serious consequence for the survival of some species, just because they're so rare. They don't occur very frequently. And, you know, when you have fewer individuals in the wild, you have a smaller population that could possibly breed. And so that's a serious problem as well. My last section, I just want to briefly talk about gardening with carnivores, because, of course, anytime you show anyone these plants, they think these are so cool, I want to add them to my garden. And it's actually pretty easy to do. There are a couple really common methods you can do a container garden. When I lived up north in Sugar Hill, that's what I did with most of my plants, because they couldn't survive the winters up there. So you're very fortunate in that you live in an area of the state that one of my friends lives in, who works in a nursery, Rolling Green Nursery. He owns Seacoast Saracena. Steve Bradshaw. He's someone who exhibits regularly at the New England Carnivorous Plant Society show, which is frequently held at Tower Hill Botanical Gardens in Massachusetts. And he always wins gold prizes because he just has pretty amazing container gardens. And he does this with pitcher plants. Really, I'd recommend talking to him. But it's really easy because these live in nutrient-poor soils. For most carnivorous plants, especially our native ones, all you really have to do is mix about half peat and half some sort of non-salty sand. So usually play sand or builder sand, or you could use perlite. So just half and half, keep it moist, put it outside. That's about it. That's what he really does with all these. Of course, he uses fancy pots, really nice pebbles. They really don't need fertilizer. They'll catch enough bugs on their own. You can fertilize them, but that's a little bit more detailed. And you can do bog gardens. So this is actually my front yard from a couple weeks ago at this point. As I put together this presentation, I have a number of plants, depending on that I really need to divide and give away some of them. And they really, the nice thing about growing carnivorous plants from the East Coast is that almost all of them will grow here in New Hampshire, at least as far north as Concord, outside year-round in bog gardens. When I say bog gardens, I mean something that's actually in the ground. So what I do is I pick a sunny location, dig a hole, put either a rigid pond liner in, so you can find these are usually round or some sort of similar shape. You can have it at Home Depot, Lowe's, or a flexible pond liner. But instead of filling it with water, you fill it with your mix of half sphagnum and half sand or perlite. And then you find some native plants, near native plants from a sustainable source, reputable online source, people who are not taking them from the wild, and you can grow them in this environment. And realistically, they're completely maintenance free. I cut them down in spring like all of my other perennials and before the new leaves come out and the flowers come out, and that's really about it once I plant them and fill them up with water once. Because generally speaking, since we have kettle bogs here in New Hampshire, it rains enough to keep the bogs wet enough most of the time that I really don't have to do anything. A couple years ago when we had that severe drought, I did have to water it a couple times in my bogs a couple times in summer, but that's really about it. I had to water everything else much more than that. There are a number of publications. As I mentioned, I'm fairly well known for carnivorous plants, so I have a book. There are other books out there that will talk about how to grow them, different species. It's a book about everything. They're really very similar to other perennials that you want to grow, except that they have to be kept moist and really in nutrient-poor soil. And really the key thing to remember is if you're going to try growing them, you want to add them to your garden. Really natives and near natives are really the best options. They don't really have a high pollination value. They flower once a year. Each plant will, depending on how large it is, usually produces one flower per growing area. And since they're rhizomes, you can, growing tips, so since they're rhizomes, you could have, 10 flowers on the same plant. But realistically, they're also eating a lot of insects, so, it doesn't really have a high pollination value in terms of that. So, anybody have any questions?
I have a quick question. I understand not disclosing locations, but you talked a little bit, one of the slides was the carnivore pictures with the sheep laurel, the rhodora, cotton grass, and the high bush blueberries.
Yep.
Would there be any way you could give any kind of a clue or direct somebody like me who wanted to see cotton grass where to go see it? I've never seen it. It looked beautiful. Or is that a safe one to say, look, I don't know.
Yeah. I probably the easiest place for you to go is Amherst has a conserved bog that's pretty well known, and they have some cotton grass there. The picture I actually showed of the Boreal bog was from the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont. The U.S. Forest Service has some conserved lands there, and some wetlands, and I don't really know how well advertised their walks are, but they have some around lakes that have pretty high density of cotton grass.
Nice, thank you.
Yep.
Saco Heath Preserve has some as well.
Saco Heath Preserve, thank you.
I have a question about the pitcher plant and the bacteria that helps break down the insects that fall in. Is that
Sure.
bacteria kind of found on the pitcher plant, or is that just general in the atmosphere, like in the wild, or is it, a symbiotic type thing there with it?
I don't know exactly how it works. I can tell you that there's a guy by the name of Arthur Ellison who works or used to work with the Harvard Forest Extension, who is really an expert on purple pitcher plants and how they work. And I think he was the one who discovered that they didn't produce digestive enzymes. And it's kind of interesting because as the pitcher grows, it grows like any other leaf from a rhizome. So you have kind of this growing tip, and the leaf comes out, and then it's obviously pitcher shaped but flat, and then it slowly inflates, and as it inflates, it also fills with some fluid, and that fluid, until the pitcher opens, is sterile. And so in southern species like Sarracenia flava, what happens are, as it captures insects, and those start to break down, it actually stimulates the release, the production and release of more digestive enzymes. But that's obviously not the case with our northern plant. And I'm not sure exactly what specific type of bacteria. I do know there are also some midge larvae and kind of other larvae that live in the pitchers occasionally. Frogs occasionally go in there because it's not, without having those digestive enzymes, it's much more friendly to sort of aquatic and semi-aquatic creatures going in temporarily, because it'll take nitrogen from really any source, whether expelled from those creatures or from digested insects.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Thanks, Nat. That was great.
Well, thank you again for having me. Happy to be able to appear via Zoom, and happy to present on this. So if anyone else ever wants me to present, I'm always happy to do it.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Thank you again.
That was nice. Thanks, Chris, for
Oh,
setting
sure,
that up.
sure.
Very informative. Okay, let's move on to, Ellen has sent along a draft kiosk interpretive panel trail map for Heron Point Sanctuary. She emailed it. Did everyone get a copy?
Yep.
Yes.
Thoughts?
I had a couple of thoughts. I think they're gorgeous and quality and whatnot. It's a question, I'm not going to say technical question, but I would rather see the beautiful photographs not askew, but have them rectilinear, have them straight. There's a real problem sometimes if you just wanted to take a screenshot of it, your phone is going to go, it's going to not know where is to make the level line. So it's a tough adjustment to make when you have photos this way and this way that might look graphically interesting, but it's really not fun to photograph a panel that's got
Yeah.
those shapes.
Okay. Did you get that, Sue?
Yeah. Right there.
Thank you. Anyone else? Great.
Well, like, all right.
Approval for the meeting minutes for last month, June 9th. I don't think I was at that meeting, so,
You weren't,
Can
and
we
he
still-
was, so.
but, okay,
We could still approve it,
all right,
and you can still vote.
excellent.
I'll make a motion. We approve.
Don't we have to correct that Colin was present?
Oh, well, I mentioned him, as being in the audience all night long.
Oh, yeah, undercover.
Undercover. And we welcomed him at that point, but he didn't feel like coming up and sitting on the,
So, we'll, make that edit? Is
Well-
that something we need to edit?
no, I don't think so, cause I think I don't know exactly where he put it, but.
That's once you get full credit, serving in your duty in the full
Here.
capacity.
Like the top of page 5, Sue.
Yeah. Page
Or maybe
four,
bottom of page 4.
yes. Okay.
Well, that's okay, it's, if it's
I'll-
in there.
I'll make sure that it,
Okay.
changes it, so.
Okay,
So
do, we-
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes from the June 9th, 2022 Conservation Commission meeting as amended.
I can second that.
all those in favor?
And you can vote.
I can.
Yeah, you can. You can too.
I always thought you couldn't if you weren't there.
Oh, that's right.
I guess.
Do that.
Yeah, if you're not there, you
It's
wouldn't know.
400.
Okay. Finance report. Ellen has put together a couple of bullet points for us. One is to approve payment of $690 from the Conservation Fund to Martin Forestry for GIS work and creation of the Heron Point Trail Map as part of the LRAC grant.
I'll make a motion to approve that.
I'll second. The other bullet point was to approve payment of up to one,
You want to
oh,
vote?
sorry,
You need
Oh,
to vote on
vote.
it first.
sorry, vote.
Okay.
Approve payment of up to what has been amended from the notes as $1,000, not 2,000, from the Conservation Fund to Kathy Arkalian for her design of 3 interpretive panels for Heron Point as part of the LRAC grant.
Is that with the little side pictures straight, not askew?
We can request that.
Okay.
I'll even make a note of it.
No excuse.
No skews.
No excuse.
Does anybody want to make a motion? I'll make a motion.
I'll second that.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
And then payment of up to $600 from the Conservation Fund for printing of the 3 kiosk panels and 2 trail maps for trail signposts at Portsmouth Sign as part of the grants from LRAC.
I would move that we approve that $600.
I'll second that. All right. Next up.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Vote. Everybody vote.
Vote.
Okay.
She's thinking Bart can't
Are we
stand
good?
up soon enough.
Get him in, get him out. Hi, Bart. Bart's here for us today. to talk about the proposed conservation budget for fiscal year 2024.
Hello, Bart McDonough, Town Planner of Newmarket. Does everyone have the budget in front of them?
I don't.
Yes.
You don't? Good make copies, but I need in front of me. So where to start? So I guess the major thing that we want to accomplish is to increase a few of the general fund requests. Right this year, helping Sue pay for her salary. The Conservation Commission went over budget. So it's being proposed that we increase the stipend, or at least the request, from $2,000 to $2,200. This will help us, buffer for next year, so we don't go over budget. I think we're over $50, $59.
I didn't buy my $100 worth of supplies, so you
Yeah,
have
you didn't.
that to have.
Right. Well, we're over. Generally, the conservation is over $3.10 from the general fund. So, but we can probably make that up. So, Alan put together a small for the general fund request. So I'll be increasing Sue's salary by $200. Contracting for CELT to monitor the Hilton stays the same at $300. Dues would increase by $100 from $400 to $500. This pays for NHACC membership, and it costs $500. So we have to meet that. General supplies from $200 to stay at $200, and postage to nothing. We didn't budget for it last year, and not being proposed this year. So the general increase request from next year's budget process from the general fund goes from $2,900 to $3,200. So $300. We would be asking town council to budget for.
So FY '24
Is it too
really
late to
FY
request adding
Correct.
another $100?
Is it too late?
Yeah, how
for
does
us?
the cycle work? Is it too late for
We can
us?
still. This is the opportunity to ask for more.
Right.
So
I would like to see us add another $100 for the, to go toward our Conservation Connections event like we did last year. We did that last year with no money and with the collaboration, for instance, with the rec department. But I think if we could budget in $100, we might be able to do something more with printing, for instance, or more with a stipend for a speaker to come and be with us, or more with something. And I don't think $100 is exorbitant to ask to put toward that event. You weren't here, but we had probably about, I don't know what you've heard about it, but we probably had altogether about 60 people involved between the symposium part and lectures part. And then at the midday, Ellen had a group of people volunteering over at Heron Point that was all kind of bundled into it. And I think if we had another $100, we could do things that would not be exorbitant, although I can't just like name them right now, but doesn't mean we have to spend the whole $100, but I'd like to see us be able to offer a stipend or something toward gas or printing. I'm not sure
or
what.
food or something. Like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, some kind of food, because it's really
Yeah.
impossible to buy food with any kind of grant.
Right.
But if we just had something in the way of, especially nowadays, people
Sure.
don't feel comfortable with, I brought this from my house, I baked it, it's delicious. But if we could just get the box of Joe, and we've lost our connection that we had with
Yeah.
Melissa. So I would put it before this commission to see if we can add $100, Bart.
Yeah, and that goes towards Conservation Connects.
Yeah,
That'd be the line item.
yes, which
Yeah.
is in fact October 15th this year.
So this is for next year's
This
season.
is for 24.
Well, yeah, but I just wanted him to know, I was just
Yep.
getting a little
Yeah, yeah.
plug
No,
in.
no.
It's a Saturday, but he might want to come.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could it be under general supplies? So if it wasn't used for that purpose, it could be used for other things?
Yeah,
Or added
Oh,
to
good
the
point.
general-
Good
added
probably
to the
could,
general
yeah.
supplies.
So it's pretty broad. So
Yeah.
so we might just maybe add to that already since it's general supplies. So
Is that
yeah,
comfortable for you to do for us?
yeah, I can look into that, and if it fits in, I think that's appropriate.
Thank you.
Great.
Mhm.
Thank you.
So in addition to that, I just want to talk about other opportunities maybe the Conservation Commission has through the CIP process.
Oh, good.
There's a lot of easements that the Conservation Commission has must monitor, and I think there's a good opportunity to maybe, since it's a benefit to the town, to have these lands, any improvements made on them. I think this is a good opportunity to request those funds. So I guess what I would have the commission be tasked towards the next meeting, because we're starting the process late August, early September, so
Yeah.
it's coming up, is come up with some proposals, which can be forwarded to the committee, and they would vote on it to pass it or recommend it to budgeting and town council ultimately. So I think it's a good opportunity just to start applying, and even if it's not selected, keep on doing it, because it's an asset to the town, I think. So, and this is and if there are any improvements want to made to that asset, I think this is a good opportunity to do that.
I'm wondering, would you be available for us to have, say, a workshop session before a meeting where you could give us some ideas of what, in your experiences, what some of these improvements to the land might be?
Yeah, so I can just go for now, like trail maintenance, invasive species removal. Those are the big ones that come to mind. If there's any infrastructure within the trails that needs to be planned for and requires significant amount of funds, so trying to think what else. Maybe the purchase of future lands, so another reserve fund that goes towards conservation in general. That's an opportunity we can look into. And then, yeah, that's what comes to mind right now that I've seen. Not necessarily the CIP process, but what I've experienced through conservation.
Yeah, that's what I was
maintenance.
looking for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, because my understanding was that the conservation fund was mostly to conserve land and not to be spent on purchasing things or new fences. Like the monies
Right.
are kind of for conserving and not improvement.
Not for
necessarily.
maintaining.
Yeah, maintenance.
So I think this is an opportunity to do that. You
Yeah,
got to
get
protect
in
your
on it.
assets that you have.
Right, because typically, my experience has been that conservation fund is just used to buy a new fence or to take a tree down or whatever.
Buy fish.
Right.
Buy fish.
Right. And then also it could be towards planning too. So planning documents that you want done. That be part of the CIP process as well. So if there's any kind of studies that you need done. So for instance, prime wetlands, the redelineation of those. That would be appropriate request, I believe. So studies, plans, infrastructure, maintenance. I think that will all be appropriate requests under the CIP process, and also grant opportunities. There's always those, but I think just from the town, what you can do within the town process would be apply for it through the CIP process. And then normal budgeting, ask them town council. So yeah, so again, $300 increase for the next fiscal year, plus the $100, so that'll be $400. And are there any other thoughts on monies you requested
Not
to
that I
use?
can think of.
Okay.
I think that's certainly a strength of Ellen's too, to be able to think
Yeah.
with these topics, how, what would
Where
be
can we
involved under
apply
any
them?
of those bullets.
Yeah.
So it sounds like an agenda item for August, and then we would still be under the timeline that you
Yeah.
would need for reporting.
So yeah, so I facilitate this process, so the CIP process. So I'm going to send out the templates that departments use and commissions.
Yeah.
So Lisa will have, the commission will have that to use to start filling in, and then the commission itself can vote on it. What do you want to propose to move forward, and then that goes to the CIP and yonder. So
Not too far yonder.
Not too far, but
No, no.
hopefully it goes far, through the process. We want
Yeah.
that. So, that's where we are right now. Anyone have questions on expenditures this year? I know we paid Salt a lot of money. So the current balance is $79,340. So there was another question Alan wanted to bring up is maybe requesting the land use change tax. Right now it's 50% that the Conservation Commission gets. Typically it's 100% in different municipalities that I've experienced. So that's just a conversation that that we'll need to have with town manager. I can start that, see exploring that opportunity. Understand what that money is going towards now, why only 50% is the commission receiving, so where's that other 50% going towards? So just understanding better what, if there's opportunity for the commission to get more money through that process as properties come online. So it's like current use, coming out of current use and whatnot. I mean, that's it, land use, current use. So anyways, Alan want to bring up the fishing derby too. It's $1,500 a year. So, is that opportunity through a different process, either through finding grants, or another process, to find that money for the fishing derby. So it's just something to bring up, I think, at the August meeting.
Yeah.
Just going through the budget, where do you think resources can be reallocated or maintained? And then where are those opportunities where we can seek additional funding? Through what processes? Any questions thus far?
Do you see any land use change tax coming through in the near future?
That's a good question. Not that I've heard of. I need to see where they all are. I need to talk to assessing to get that data. My understanding there's not too many properties, but how big are those properties?
Yeah.
That's a different question.
Yeah.
So I believe next Monday, Mike Pelletier, I'll talk to him and see if he has that data available. Because sometimes you might not have it in vision, but I imagine it probably is there. So at the next meeting, I'll have that information.
Okay. I know that when they were doing the golf course, sometimes it took quite a while for the money to trickle back down into the conservation fund. Yeah, that could have been, when do you pay it? Right, exactly. Which is what it was about. When you actually, when it's developed. Yeah.
Nope. I think we're a good thing to have, which I can easily make, is through GIS, is identify those parcels that are under current use. So you all have that.
That'd be helpful.
And then,
Yeah.
so it's all available, and we understand, which parcels those are. So when they come online for development, that money's going to the coffers of the Conservation Commission and the town in general. So, I think that's easily achievable. So, I'd be happy to do that too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I may ask the question when it comes to the planning board report, if you have a second.
Yeah, sure.
We get to that.
Okay,
Committee.
go ahead.
So there hasn't been much in front of the planning board that I really saw was a huge interest of the Conservation Commission, except the discussion we're going to have at our next meeting, which is some of the rezoning at the north end of town.
I'm not sure I can't hear you very well.
So there hasn't been much in front of the planning board, or at least in the past month, that I think it would be of much interest to the Conservation Commission in general.
Yeah.
Most of it's been in high and dry areas and already
Yeah.
developed portions of town. but I do know that at our next meeting, when I would just mention that you may want to attend the next meeting or watch the next meeting.
So the next meeting is for accessory dwelling units.
Oh.
The last meeting at the planning board, it was to get the planning board's kind of, yes, let's move forward type of deal. So let's continue this process. So I won't have anything ready. What I will have ready is documents from prior meetings,
Yep.
Which were requested on what was thought, what zoning changes were envisioned for that
Right.
area, and how that may evolve through this process.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I just thought the presentation of those materials, so
Oh, yeah.
folks
Yep.
could get like a geographic idea
Yes.
of what parcels might be covered
Yeah.
with rezoning.
Yeah. I think that's
Not
yeah.
like Bart said, early discussions
Yeah.
of potential rezoning.
right. So what I'll be doing is finding those documents and making them available online, as well on the next agenda, plan board agenda, put it in their packets so they have paper copies of that. But just make it more accessible because the town is going to move forward with that process. But if you are interested, I'll make a plug. ADUs, accessory dwelling units. That will be a draft proposal in front of the planning board at the next meeting, and I'll have a small presentation as well. So I encourage you to watch and participate if you so choose.
Thank you. What's the date on that?
August 9th. Yeah.
August.
It's okay.
And if you're
Need to agree.
the area of rezoning was discussed in a joint meeting between the latest joint meeting between the planning board and the town council, where there's a presentation done, and the gates to town were Stu Arnett's presentation, the gates to the town were kind of discussed potential areas of
That's
change.
still available on DCAT.
Okay, yeah. So
Good plug. Yeah.
yeah, I was wondering where that was available
Yeah.
actually,
It's available on DCAT.
because they go into a little bit of a discussion about the area that we'll
Yeah.
be looking
I
at.
think what I'll do, so I've created a new web page in the plan departments is proposed zoning changes. So what I'll do is put all the documents for the M2 North Gate area, as long as the link to the DCAT link to that meeting, which the joint meeting was, so people can orientate themselves and get caught up on all the efforts that have been made thus far. Very exciting stuff from the planning board side, and definitely conservation has a part there.
Thank you, Bart.
Thanks, Bart.
Yep. You're welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other issues?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, great. Town council, sustainable energy goals.
Yes, we are set to discuss that at the second reading and vote coming up next week at our Wednesday meeting. There's been discussion about some verbiage changes in the goals. So that will be discussed again and then voted on in our next meeting, which is a week from yesterday on the 20th.
What's the change?
I believe it was the use of the word commit, that the town would commit, being too strict of a parameters, maybe changing it something along the lines of aspire or set a goal.
Yep.
Instead of the use of that word, so
Less,
nothing drastic,
less
nothing.
committed.
I did not say less committed. Didn't say it wasn't. Less restricting. how's
There you
that?
go. Okay.
Less
Confining,
confining.
that's the word.
Well, there's a trained professional.
Thank you. And Riverfront Advisory.
Yeah, I was waffling about whether to tack this on to Bart's CIP discussion or just wait my turn. But the most relevant item I think for the members of Concom related to Riverfront. We had met June 13th, so not long after our last meeting, and we have another meeting scheduled for this coming Monday, the 18th. One of the things I think is going to be worth discussing at that time, what we have spent the most time talking about over the last few months has been primarily advancing the concept of a living shoreline at Shanda Park and seeing if the town basically has interest for that. We have also been spending a lot of time discussing the outfall of Moonlight Brook also at Shanda Park and kind of the submerged and plugged culverts, the how the land bridge and all that sort of blocks the outfall itself, especially with the culverts blocked up. The rock wall at Shanda has also been deteriorating for a while. And just the overall potential improvement to stormwater flow that addressing the outfall would be. We've spent a lot of time talking about those items together, and I think most of last meeting was kind of the realization that we may need to fracture those two things apart, that the timelines between them are likely just too different, and we can have a pretty high chance of success potentially seeking grant participation for the living shoreline part, and the Moonlight Brook thing is really kind of more of an infrastructure project that's sort of slowing up the shoreline part in consideration of that. So the relevance to the committee is, again, we'll try to kind of discuss it and see if we can get something for our next Concom meeting, August 10th, but the concept of Conservation Commission with Shanda Park being a Concom property and this committee, or this commission proposing a CIP article to address the outfall of Moonlight Brook and having that originate here, the Riverfront Advisory Committee would then tack on and say, yes, that's what we would want to do, and see if it can pick up steam, but have this kind of be the progenitor of that request to the town, as it's clearly an infrastructure item and on a property managed by us. So again, more detail to follow, but depending on the exact time, would we have to vote in August, or would there be a chance that we could table that to September? I always kind of know that CIP meeting seems to be kind of early September, so I don't know if the
Yeah,
timing
they usually
would
start
work.
in September, so it's probably ideal that during that workshop, everything would be ready. The workshop prior to the meeting would basically set up for the meeting to vote on it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah, maybe come Monday we can talk about it.
Yeah.
We'll take a look at the template.
Yeah.
And we'll try to, knowing that from a timing perspective, this committee may need to vote to support or advance it at the next meeting, try to get that to people ahead of time, so it's not like, all right, here's this, can you vote on it? Like, give everyone a little time to consider what's happening and what the request is.
So that, just out of curiosity, so that when you do the CIP form that you're mentioning, distribute the template.
Yeah.
So you enter a dollar value there,
Yes.
and so the Riverfront Committee has a rough dollar value or something for the commission to think about for that infrastructure.
Potentially. I think some of it also may be the foot in the door concept.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's also, it doesn't have to be all at once too. You can accumulate year after year.
Gotcha.
Yeah, you know, kind of almost building your line item. So you don't have to ask for the full year, ideally maybe in this situation, but
Yep.
you know, if it came down to it, you know, you can ask for a partial, and then towards your ultimate goal. Then the following year, you do another request for money just to add to it.
And there's likely at least one, if not two, study efforts that have to be made basically on the hydrology of it, of what do we actually need to do? Okay, you want to replace it. Well,
Yeah.
with what? What's the backing of that? So there is going to be an engineering and design iteration that needs to occur. So maybe for now, it's just request something to get that portion of it done while you wait to figure out what the actual infrastructure portion looks like.
Understood. So thanks.
Yeah, and not to put work on someone's plate, but we also have a town engineer coming online, so she would help us with maybe there's some in-house opportunities as well. So she has experience with this types of analyses. So not saying that's what she'll be doing primarily, but again, just another asset the town has, a resource to help us achieve the commission's goals.
Great. Thanks, Bart.
Yep. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Thank you, boards and committees. Great info. Events. Something tells me you are the one to run with this.
To run the event, run the discussion about the events. Sure. The first one here is August 5th, the townwide backyard bash, spearheaded by Amy at the Park and Rec Department. And the biggest question I've gotten so far is this kind of a revisit of Old Home Day? So the short answer is yes. So there's food, music, kids games, adult games, bands. So yes, all those things that you might associate with Old Home Day, but centered over at the rec center on the big fields there and the amphitheater space there and the splash pad there. So it's set to start at 5 o'clock, go 5 o'clock till 10 o'clock. And it's not too late if we wanted to have something there in the way of handing out trail maps or photos or something. We certainly don't have to. There's 20 organizations, clubs, associations, things like Rotary, Lions Club, the Newmarket Community Church. They'll have booths and events and kids games and whatnot there. So I think it sounds like a really nice old-fashioned summer night. The first band is Marjorie Sennett and the Broken Home Boys, and the second band is New Nord. Both of them have long-term ties here to Newmarket, so that should be a draw. And food trucks.
Yay.
And I don't know if in Town Hall we're not supposed to talk about BEER, but you brought it up earlier. So BEER tent from Deciduous Brewing Company will be there, so that could be interesting. And it's a plant, so it fits in with conservation.
There you go.
Yep. We're working on the food trucks right now. So we have one with a tie bend to it. We have, do you have a special request, menu request brought to you by Bart?
No, I'm a fan of all food, so any food trucks.
All food. Oh,
Yes.
okay, good. Duly noted. Okay, keep Bart happy. Gotcha. Then our next Conservation Commission monthly meeting, our guest will be Barbara Richter, the executive director of the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions. So she'll talk to us a little bit about some things that happened with this legislative session that we could be aware of, things that could be brewing that we could be aware of. Think about questions we might send her in advance, because she is a real storehouse of knowledge about situations that have come up that are funky for conservation commissions or whatnot. She's really the go-to for that. And also I thought it might help us to understand a little bit more about what the membership means. We think of it maybe initially as being, okay, you get a discount to go to the conference, the state conference. That's going to be in person this year at Pembroke Academy again. I haven't committed the date to memory. I want to say November 11th, but don't jot that down. So more than just that differential price tiering if we're members, but the things that the NHACC can offer and what's in their bank of resources for us. We'll hear about that from Barbara. Then September 8th, a topic that we've talked a little bit, or that Bart touched upon, was conservation easement monitoring. That's Emma Tutine. We've had her before. You might recognize the name. She was the one that we had early on when we started having guests. She talked about the trail mapping and how to report trails and trail conditions and what you're seeing on trails. But she's a great resource for us about conservation easement, and that's something I think we can all learn from. And some of the things you look for and do and change do change with regulations and best practices and whatnot. Pursuant to that, I would like to see us still talk about a little sliver of the $1,000 that we got from our Scout project, donated back to us from the Scout project. I'd really like to see us have safety vests that say Newmarket Conservation, so when we're out doing this, people know right away who we are and what we're doing. But that's another topic, I guess, to talk about. But September 8th, Emma Tutine, and then moving into October, the Conservation Connections Saturday event. And we do have the approval or permission from Amy at the rec department to have a van again, although we're hoping to have the event here in town hall, but have the rec van be able to do tours. We haven't talked at all about what will that tour look like, but the van's available, as is a plan that we had in place in the ground zero period of COVID, was to have New Hampshire Dark Sky Society come and set up telescopes. That's a possibility for October 15th, and that could be at the rec department property, since they've got the big open field, nice parking, and potentially access to restrooms or warming up in the building, depending on the weather. So that's something we're working on for October 15th as well.
Thank you.
Those would be my events.
Great.
Not my events, the events to share
Yes,
with
the
the group.
events to share. Do you want to tack on to that and just do a little bit about the libraries, the thing over at
Certainly,
Ms.
certainly, I
Castle points
would.
out?
Yeah. So we did hear from Carrie, the library director, at our recent meeting about she wanted the permission to put the story walk up on the Piscassic Glozell property. It's there, and I just asked her, in fact, yesterday, thinking of this meeting tonight, what kind of data might they have, because they had been asking people, tag us if you've been there, or report if you've been there, because they're using it as a ticket for their summer reading program for kids and families that have gone out to be on that story walk. She didn't get that answer back to me, but she has anecdotal feedback about it being successful. I also have anecdotal feedback where people want another one. They want to know, when's the other one? When's the next one? So I think we did right by approving it. I will also say that I've checked on it a couple of times. The pathway is brittle as brittle can be due to the weather. And I also think that since that story walk has been installed, we've had some inordinately hot and humid weather. So some people might have woke up that morning and said, great, we're taking the kids on the story walk, and it was just blisteringly ridiculous weather. So I don't know if that's impaired the number of people that we might have had otherwise at the walk, but I can anecdotally report it's been successful. They will come back and be looking for a second story walk, that site or another site, but that one's just so darn easy. You park, you walk, you see, and you can also go back and go further into the woods where the big boulders are and whatnot. So that's been a success, and I know they're happy and grateful for that chance.
Cool.
Go read the story yourself. It's Henry David Thoreau. I mean, that's just so cool to read about. So
That's neat. Thank you.
yeah.
Bart, did you have something else?
Just thinking,
Tacos.
tacos and conservation easements.
Yeah.
When Ellen was a consultant with Durham, she did a great job in putting together a book for each easement that had everything about that easement.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
We're putting the.
You're doing okay.
Yep.
So I was just wondering, maybe that's an opportunity to find some funding for a person, a consultant, to do that for the commission, so that we can help out the commission. So that's something to think about as we move towards our workshop.
Great. Thank you. That's a good idea.
Thank you.
I have a question. Has anyone been to Smith Sisters lately?
I have not.
I've gone by there many times now, and the kiosk that used to be there is completely engulfed in foliage. And it's gotten worse and worse and worse. There's a kiosk there, so you go in and you pull in and you park it where the old golfing thing used to be.
Oh, that's the
That's not
Audubon.
Oh, okay. But who should cut the stuff down from around the kiosk?
Audubon.
Audubon.
Okay. Somebody should probably tell them that it's completely and utterly obliterated. I mean, it's like you see two little brown things up at the top.
Oh, no kidding.
All right. Thank you.
Sounds like an invasive species pull to me.
Hey. You need big secateurs for those.
All right. Anyone else?
Not to make fun of it. That's a good idea, though.
Yeah.
I can call Audubon if you want somebody to take that task on and ask and
Do it.
inquire.
Chris, you're my hero.
Maybe will you like me more if I just took my clippers there in my car and just like take that and that and that?
If you want to name each one.
Yeah, right.
All right.
Tim,
if
erase the
there's
tape.
Nothing else.
Rosemary Woods, please erase that tape.
I'm going to move that we adjourn.
Sam?
I will second that.
All right, thanks, guys.
Oh,
Oh, all those in favor? Vote! Get out and vote!
I was used to say all those in favor signify by going home.
Yes, that's a good one.
All those opposed, we'll see you when we get back.